Hey, happy holidays, E7 fam. Pat here, back with another how to play guide you all voted for. And this one, we're going to be talking about the girl that no matter what you tell me, you cannot fix, Abyssal Yufine. In this video, we're going to go over almost everything you can want to know about the character, right down to the minute details. And trust me, there are a lot of them. So things like stats, skills, the only real endgame equipment build that anybody plays on this character, and of course, matchup knowledge. So without any further ado, please enjoy the video and have a happy holiday season. Abyssal Yufine, and yes, I'm going to pronounce it as Yufine throughout this video. I know some of you guys really hate how I pronounce it, and you love to let me know in the comment section down below, but here is a clip of former Epic 7 director Yuna Kim and how she chooses to pronounce the character's name.
바캉스 유피네가 활약할 특별한 여름 서브스토리 푸른 성 십자회와 이상한 섬은 아직 유피네가 샬롯과 함께 에우레카로 떠나기 전의 이야기입니다.
As you could hear, she pronounces it Yupine, which is very close to Yufine, so that's basically why I pronounce it the way that I do. Anyways, she is a Dark Knight of the Aquarius zodiac symbol. She has a unique stat line. Taking a closer look at her stats, she has 830 attack, 713 defense, 6,619 health, 106 base speed, 23% critical hit chance, 150% critical hit damage, and no starting effectiveness or effect resistance. This translates to well below attack score for a 5-star in Epic 7, but we don't really care, as you'll find out in the next section. Abyssal Yufine is a defense scaling hero. She has really high defense, even for a knight, and respectable HP for a knight at a slightly above average when compared to the rest of the cast of, again, 6,600. Speed is a little lower than average, but it's balanced out by the starting critical hit chance. Overall, pretty good stat line. Most Aquarius zodiac symbols have pretty good stats overall, or just kind of broken ones in the case of, say, Conqueror Lilius. As a bit of trivia before moving on to the skill section, in the English dub of Epic 7, as you may already know, Yufine, as well as characters such as Charlotte and Vivian, are voiced by Kat Cressida. She might be the most featured voiceover artist on my channel in this segment at this point, because again, she voices a lot. She is most well known for voicing Dee Dee from the 90s cartoon Dexter's Laboratory. In the Japanese dub of Epic 7, however, Yufine is voiced by Yumiri Hanamori, who you can hear in gacha games such as Arc Knights and Genshin Impact as Ifrit and Yanfei, respectively. You could also hear her as Sagiri in Hell's Paradise, which was one of my favorite anime of 2023.
I don't even know anymore.
Abyssal Yufine's S1 is Dragon's Breath. You acquire 20 Fighting Spirit upon use. It is an AoE attack with a 0.7x attack multiplier, as well as a 90% max defense multiplier. It has a 45 to 60% chance, depending on Molagora, to decrease the attack of all enemies for 1 turn. When Yufine is inflicted with trauma, activates Unbridled Outburst instead of Dragon's Breath. We'll talk more about trauma when we visit the S3 skill in just a moment.
I don't really enjoy this. No.
So a couple of things to note with Dragon's Breath. Traditionally, AoE basic skills are very strong. Characters like Dizzy and Bellion, because of how strong their basic skill is, were pretty dominant in their heyday. Pretty much only Holiday Yufine didn't have a super impactful basic skill that's AoE. Again, usually basic skills that are AoE are very, very good. On top of that, Dragon's Breath has pretty good multipliers. On average, I'd say about 0.8x attack multiplier is what you'd expect to see from a AoE attack. This is a 0.7. But remember, it does have that defense scaling component to it. So it's going to come out to about average to slightly above average for an AoE attack. So why are basic attacks so good if they're AoE? Well, they're insane value when you consider if you actually proc a counter attack with them, because that is a lot of damage going out to your opponent's team on your opponent's turn, in addition to the fact that you're going to be AoEing them on your turn. On top of that, if the multipliers are good, which we established they are, great with the lifesteal set, makes it very difficult to get that character off the board, because a single basic skill will heal them back up to full, or at least very close to it, in a lot of cases. One final point, as of the recording of this video, attack down, which is great against attack scaling, and injury, which is great against health scaling, are fairly common. Defense break doesn't feel as common, at least to me, in the current metagame. Or maybe it's just because people, or myself in general, are more on guard when dealing with defense breaks. In general, it just feels like defense scaling heroes are a bit harder to deal with in the current Epic 7 metagame, which is another reason why Dragon's Breath is fairly good. Speaking of fairly good, let's talk about Abyssal Yufine's S2 passive, Inner Abyss. When the enemy is not an elite or boss monster, reduces the effective combat readiness increases granted to the enemy by 30 to 50% depending on Molagora. This effect does not stack with other passive effects of the same name. When Abyssal Yufine is attacked, she gains 20 fighting spirit and has a 30% chance to counterattack. At the start of the turn, when fighting spirit is full, Abyssal Yufine will dispel all debuffs from herself. So let's break this down. The first component of Inner Abyss is essentially Astral Guide, which is Politis' passive and has historically been one of the strongest passive skills in all of Epic 7. It's one of the reasons why people considered, or at least did in the past, Politis a staple PvP unit, because combat readiness is one of the most effective ways to win the game. You take more turns than the opponent, you're probably going to end up winning that game. On top of that, this is a hyper carry character, which means your opponent is inherently going to want to focus the character down because they don't want to die to the character. Well, she's a defense scaling hero, so she's going to be pretty tanky. And if you focus fire her and fill her fighting spirit gauge, well, you may just die faster. On top of that, you have the 30% chance to counter built in, which is another reason why you wouldn't want to actually attack her. The counterattack chance also means you don't actually have to wear the counter set, and we'll talk more about that in the character build section after this one. So already, really good start. We're 3 for 3 on amazing components to a passive. And the last component makes it so that she has a built-in dispel, so you can't kind of CC her to stop her from doing her thing. In fact, if your opponent is on a control composition with very low damage, you don't even have to burn the fighting spirit for the skill 3. You can just sit on full fighting spirit and simply spam Dragon's Breath to win the game. Overall, Inner Abyss is one of the strongest passive skills in E7 history. I'm not going to say definitively it's the best passive skill we've ever had, but it is a large portion of why Abyssal Yufine, at least as of the recording of this video, is considered so strong. Abyssal Yufine's skill 3 is her signature skill, Frenzied Strike. It consumes 100 fighting spirit to use this move. You acquire 3 souls upon use, and interestingly, it has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown depending on Molagora. Inflicts trauma on Abyssal Yufine for 3 turns before initiating an AoE attack with a 1.1x attack multiplier, dispelling all buffs from all enemies, and decreasing the combat readiness of all enemies by 50%. This move, very important, ignores effect resistance.
Okay. Then how is this? You like it when I hurt you?
Okay, so let's talk trauma. First things first. Trauma is considered a debuff. Note the red border, which means it doesn't count towards buff punishing characters such as, say, Greenlandy, for example. As you can see on your screen, trauma decreases the defense of Abyssal Yufine by 70%, but it increases her attack and speed by 100%. So, what does this mean? If you have a 200 speed Abyssal Yufine, with trauma, she's actually a 400 speed character. If you have, say, 2500 attack, well, now she is a 5000 attack character. You're basically getting double the attack and speed stats. So whatever you see in the menu when you build the character, simply double the number. That is what she's going to be. You'll note here also, if the defense of Abyssal Yufine prior to the effect of trauma is 2000 or higher, the stat increase effects are double. So, if you had a 200 speed Abyssal Yufine, to use our example from earlier, you would have a 600 speed Abyssal Yufine with trauma up if her defense is at least 2000 when you activate the skill 3. This is a insanely strong debuff and is one of the reasons why Abyssal Yufine is so strong. You will get the 50% pushback from Frenzied Strike, remove all of their buffs, and there is a very, very high chance that Abyssal Yufine will get another turn, and possibly even 2 turns consecutively. So, using the skill 3 might mean you get 3 turns in a row when set up properly, depending on the enemy's position and their base speeds and so on and so forth. This is very, very scary because, as we mentioned with Dragon's Breath, skill 1 changes when you have trauma. It is going to be Unbridled Outburst. Unbridled Outburst has a 0.8x attack multiplier and penetrates 70% of the target's defense. Normally, 0.8x attack is not very good for a multiplier. But remember, we essentially have triple our attack score. So it's possible for Abyssal Yufine to have over 6,000 attack when using this move. And remember, it ignores a huge, huge portion of the enemy's defense.
I'll break you.
Abyssal Yufine's Soul Burn for the cost of 10 souls changes the multiplier of Unbridled Outburst or of Dragon's Breath, depending on which mode you're in for Abyssal Yufine. For Unbridled Outburst, it changes the multiplier to 1.25x attack multiplier while still retaining the 70% defense penetration rate.
I can't breathe right.
The Soul Burn, when you're in the standard Abyssal Yufine mode, basically the tank mode, changes the multiplier to a 0.9x attack multiplier, as well as a 110% max defense multiplier. That's essentially 0.2x more for the attack and 20% more overall. The damage boost for the Soul Burn as Dragon's Breath is decent, and you should use it if it's going to pick off a character like, say, Spectre Tenebria, but otherwise there might be a better use for your souls. With Unbridled Outburst, it is absolutely worth using because the damage is so high, it can outright one-shot even the tankiest characters in Epic 7.
I can do it too. Here I come.
When it comes to Molagora priorities, I highly recommend maxing the S1 first, as this is the primary source of damage on the character. You want to get this up as much as possible because you'll be using it on your turn. You'll be using it to kill characters with Unbridled Outburst. It will be what you are retaliating with when you actually counterattack. After that, level up Frenzied Strike because this is going to be bonus damage that sets up kills for the S1. And then finally, level up Inner Abyss for the combat readiness decrease. You might want to prioritize Inner Abyss higher than I have it here if you are somebody who is afraid of cleave comps. If that is the primary reason you're taking this character into battle to limit the combat readiness push, then absolutely kind of get that up first and foremost for your priorities. Overall, this character is a hyper carry and a DPS one, so you should absolutely plus 15 this character. As of the recording of this video, Abyssal Yufine is one of the most picked and highest win rate characters in Epic 7's World Arena. She is one of the most dominant characters on Arena defense. She's one of the most dominant characters on Guild War defense as well. So it's not really a surprise to me that all of you voted for this character in my poll the other day on which character would you like to see a how to play guide for the end of 2023. But just like with how to play Conquer Ilias and how to play Arya, this is a very difficult character to play in terms of what it requires. So I'm putting the disclaimer out there now. When it comes to equipment builds for this character builds in this section, there's really only one way to play Abyssal Yufine. Yes, you could play something like Counterset, but as we just talked about with Inner Abyss in the previous section, the character already has an 8 counter chance. So doubling up on that doesn't really seem as impactful. And the data that we have now with things like the Epic 7 OP.GG equivalent, it's just not there. We don't really want to be playing Counterset. It's not proven to be successful. Injury, similar story. There are a couple of edge cases on Speed Set where it could work out on Abyssal Yufine, but again, looking at the data, not a great win rate, I'm going to be honest with you, and the play rate is also pretty abysmal. It's about like 0.5% or less. So I've decided to not really cover it because 99.5% of the time, you're going to be playing this character on lifesteal. And since she is a hyper carry by nature, you're going to want to have a bunch of stats, just like we talked about with something like How to Play Lone Crescent Bologna. You just really want stats, and she's played on a set that doesn't give stats. It's just as simple as that. So how I've decided to approach this section is to show you 2 sets of desired stats for lifesteal. One for you to start out with, which has roughly around an 85% per piece average equipment score, which I think is obtainable for some of you who've been playing for like 6 months to a year. And then I'll show you what you actually really want to be playing her on, which is like closer to like 420 to 430 gear score in the old kind of way that we phrase things. And that's kind of like 90 to 95 equipment score per piece average for those of you that care about the equipment score. All right, good. Got that out of the way. Let's jump in and take a look at the desired stats. I am on a lifesteal build. Obviously, our primary sets are going to be lifesteal, and I recommend as your offset some kind of 2-piece set that gives you bonus stats because, again, very stat-hungry character, want as much gear score / equipment score as possible. So for this, I've chosen Critical Hit Chance because it's the one that most people have access to. It will make the character the easiest to build. Looking at the alternative 2-piece sets, you can use health and defense, and those are the next best ones, in my opinion, because they give stats. Immunity is actually the highest played one in terms of pick rate at higher levels of play, but I don't necessarily think you actually need it. And Unity is a fun meme that you can also try out. I really think that Unity in general is an underplayed set, so that's why I have included it here. You'll note here also that it says assumes no imprints. And if you look at the footage on your screen now, you'll see that I have Abyssal Yufine set to the team imprint and not the self imprint. As you recall, the debuff trauma requires you to have 2,000 or more defense. If you get into a situation, say maybe against Cleave, where you need the team imprint in order for certain characters on your team to survive, if the self imprint brings you underneath 2,000 defense, you lose all of the additional benefits of the trauma debuff. So we are not including any imprints, and I highly recommend that you not use the self imprint on this character, or if you are going to do so, you at least keep in mind that if you switch to the team imprint, you could be giving up matches that you otherwise normally should win. Got it? Good. Taking a look at the desired stats here. Attack is 1,472. This is Yufine's base attack with an I-90 weapon with the recommended artifact, which is Holy Sacrifice. You can increase this, and we will talk more about it in the next section, but the gist of it is essentially having higher attack on the character, despite the fact that she is a defense scaling hero, means that when you do go into trauma, she hits that much harder. You want both defense and attack ideally on this character because, remember, your stats are basically tripled while you're under the effects of trauma, assuming you have at least 2,000 defense on the character. So in this example here, around 1,500 attack or so is going to actually be 4,500 under the effects of trauma, closer to 2,000 attack, around 6,000 attack under the effects of trauma. Defense is 2,000 to obviously get the full benefit of the trauma debuff. Any more than that is going to obviously increase your damage in base Yufine form and increase your survivability. Speaking of survivability, 17k health is about the average. Most of the best Yufines have a little bit more than this, and we'll talk about that in the very next build. 160 speed, this is a sacrifice that I decided to make. The average is probably closer to 170. I just wanted to make this character as easy to access for most players as possible, and this is one of the sacrifices I made. Honestly, you don't lose a whole heck of a lot by going too much slower with Abyssal Yufine. I've seen people play her in around 140 base speed range, so if you want to go even slower than this in order to bump up the rest of your stats, you are welcome to do so. This is just the speed range that I have found to be the average amongst all players that I have gathered data on for the purposes of this video. Critical hit chance is 100%, so that way we can critically strike as often as possible because we are a hyper carry. Critical hit damage is 220%. Ideally, you'd like this to be a bit higher, but I made a compromise in order to make it so that this character is as accessible as possible. Effectiveness is 0% because our S3 ignores ER, and the debuff chance on S1 isn't particularly good, and since Inner Abyss has a built-in cleanse, no reason for effect resistance either. Taking a look at the right side gear, I am on a critical hit damage necklace in order to do as much damage as possible. If you are struggling to gear this character, try a critical hit chance necklace. That is a good alternative. Ring is defense percentage, not only for survivability, but damage, because we are, most of the time at least, a defense scaling hero. Ring could also be health percentage for survivability if you decide to go for, say, something like defense percentage on the boots with speed as a substat. Speaking of speed, that is the main stat and recommended boot because it gives the most amount of equipment score. It just makes the math the simplest, which is why I've chosen it. You could also choose, for example, health percentage if you decide to not go for the target speed and just bump up the rest of the stats. That is an option available to you. Artifact is Holy Sacrifice. This is the one that most people have success with across a slew of game modes, across all types of ranks. I will say this is a percentage-based artifact. If you're not at least plus 24 on Holy Sacrifice, it's just simply not going to be that consistent. 90% is where I think I'd be okay with wanting to play it, but if you have only a plus 15 Holy Sacrifice, please consider an alternative such as Elber's Ritual Sword, which is definitely a viable option. Even if you have a plus 30 Holy Sacrifice, for some of you, Elber's Ritual Sword is going to be better performing for you based on your playstyle and just general preferences. So there's nothing wrong at all with playing Elber's Ritual Sword. Yes, I think Holy Sacrifice is good for my preference and the way that I play the game, but Elber's might be better for you. Mature Sunglasses is another great alternative. Increase in damage, also damage reduction in order to keep her alive. It's kind of like the middle ground. Elber's gives you the most amount of potential damage, whereas Holy Sacrifice gives you the most amount of survivability, which allows you to get off that S3 going to trauma. The most consistent. Mature Sunglasses falls squarely in the middle. Now I recognize that one of these is basically a whale artifact, Holy Sacrifice, because you need multiples. Elbrus is a highly in-demand artifact that you might not have multiples of, and Mature Sunglasses is a limited one. Abyssal Yufine is a very stat-hungry, equipment score-intensive character. She is one of the hardest characters to build in the game. She is very late-game / end-game oriented, and unfortunately, she just doesn't seem to work as well without those rare artifacts or those artifacts that just require a lot of investment, a lot of copies. It's as simple as that. If there are any alternatives for my free-to-play bros or newer players that you guys have figured out, please let everyone know down in the comment section below. Looking at the per piece average, is going to be 18% defense, 16% health, 11% critical hit chance, and 2 speed. If you decide you want more damage, you could also choose, say, critical hit damage in this spot to go over the 220 that I talked about originally. Now let's pivot and talk about where these stats want to be if you are a more late game or end game oriented player, somebody that's really trying to climb very high up the ladder. It's still a lifesteal build, but you'll notice our desired stats are quite a bit higher here. Taking a look at them, I have 1800 attack. This is about the average that I see on ladder. I see at least 1700 in most cases. I've seen as high as 2000. I've decided to go with around 1800 here just to kind of illustrate that point, that this is kind of where you want to ballpark the character. Defense is usually between like 2050 and like 2200. I've decided to park it at 2100. Obviously, higher defense means it's harder to kill the character. Means that she does more damage when she doesn't have access to trauma. If you can want to go like super high, 2200 plus, you are more than welcome to do so. Health is 18k. The tankiest ones that I've seen are over 20k, but they're usually much slower than the target speed that I have here in this desired stat section. I personally play around 19.5k or so HP. I find that having a tankier Yufine, especially when combined with Holy Sacrifice, makes it very, very difficult for your opponent to stop you from getting off Frenzied Strike and going into trauma, which is why having the higher defense health combination is worth it, at least to me. Your mileage may vary. You may want to drop the health in favor of, say, more attack, more defense. If you're a very aggressive player, that is definitely an option for you. Speed I have is 170 because it's about the average that I see. Slowest I've seen, about 140 or so. Fastest I've seen, closer to 190. So kind of pick your range. Anywhere within that range, I think you'll be fine with the character. Critical hit chance, still 100% because it's a hyper carry. Needs to deal damage. Critical hit damage, I have 240% because it seems to be about the average that I see, but I've seen around as high as like 280 or 290. Your mileage may vary based on what sacrifices you want to make, whether that's like going to like say 16k HP and like 140 speed in favor of just hitting really hard and having more critical hit damage. More power to you. I leave that to your discretion. Taking a look at the right side, it's exactly the same as before in the previous build, but looking at the per piece average, you can see it is quite a bit higher at 22% defense per piece average, 19% health, 11% critical hit chance, 4 speed, 4% critical hit damage, and 8% attack. That is quite a lot of stats to get in 6 pieces. This is why I decided not to show this as the one and only build in the entire video, because this is like 420 to 430 gear score average, which is like 95 equipment score per piece average for those of you who use the ES system. And that's just not really friendly to those of you who've been playing for maybe only like 6 months to a year. And I don't like doing that in the How to Play series. The How to Play series is meant to give you an avenue to play a character that you want to play. I don't want to just say, hey, your gear's not good enough, you can't play it. So that is why this compromise was made. Hopefully I did a good enough job. Hopefully it made this character easier and more accessible to you. As always, let's round out this video with some matchup knowledge. Let's start with allies first for Abyssal Yufine. She's pretty good in a huge variety of team compositions with a ton of different teammates. Some of the best ones that I've found over the last month or so of playing the character include characters like, say, Conqueror Lilius, one of the best openers in the game, and her S1 Kneel Down synergizes incredibly well with Abyssal Yufine's Dragon's Breath, which allows you to obviously get a ton of damage on the enemy team and also stack up that fighting spirit. Last Rider Crow is great because this is a character you don't normally want to play Abyssal into, but also has a ton of AoE damage as well with his S3 mobile weapon Siegfried. Again, synergizing very well with all of the AoE damage coming out of Abyssal Yufine. Characters like Ocean Breeze Lulika and Shadow Knight Pillis are also very, very good for this character because they provide a defense buff, which will not only help reduce the damage that Yufine takes in the long run, but also amp up the damage while providing support and damage rolls respectively. You can also choose to play Abyssal Yufine with a character like Rand to set up a cleave. You basically choose Abyssal Yufine in the spots where cleave would normally take something like Politis to stop the combat readiness. She just basically is very good there, good AoE damage, and can definitely capitalize on Rand's defense break. Death Dealer Ray is one of the most oppressive characters as of the recording of this video. He's just an incredibly good support damage dealer combo, and obviously Pestilence is insanely strong with any AoE based damage dealer. So if it's good for Solitary of the Snow, it's going to be really good for Abyssal Yufine as well. Moving on to good matchups, Abyssal Yufine has one of the highest win rates in the game as of the recording of this video. She's great into a number of things. Because of her S2 passive Inner Abyss, she's really good at punishing characters that rely on combat readiness pushes to do their job. Think of things like Jacko Valentine needs the combat readiness push in order to accomplish a cleave. Designer Lilibet needs the combat readiness push from emergency stitching in order to actually cleanse for her team. So very, very good into characters like that. You also have characters like Bellion and Solitary of the Snow, which pretty much are forced to use AoE attacks, which will charge the fighting spirit on Abyssal Yufine, allow you to get to that frenzied strike, and just go on a rampage with trauma that much faster. Abyssal Yufine, because she's all AoE damage, also great against a character like Spectre Tenebria. It's one of the reasons why Spectre isn't as commonly played in the current format. And the last one I want to highlight here is Navy Captain Landy. This one is kind of, I want to say, a little bit 50-50. It's slightly in Abyssal Yufine's favor. The math and the data that we have shows that Yufine wins this match like 55 to 60% of the time. So she technically is advantaged, but Landy is Landy, can get very lucky, can win. If you go for Frenzied Strike and Landy gets a Elbrus proc or a counter into a salvo, that might spell your doom. So yeah, most of the time, Yufine is favored. The numbers suggest that she is favored, but I do want to kind of stress that there are times where Navy Captain Landy can get the better of you. The one thing you don't really have to worry about that badly is actually mobilize the warship, because if you somehow survive it, which, Yufine's tanky enough, she can absolutely do that, you don't have to worry about the stun and the loss of turns because of Inner Abyss and its cleansing properties, so do keep that in mind. Finally, let's talk about bad matchups. And I gotta start with my boy, Martial Artist Ken. This is by far the worst matchup for Abyssal Yufine because Trauma is a debuff that activates before Frenzied Strike. And Frenzied Strike can be countered, which means that when you press S3, there's a very high chance that when Martial Artist Ken counters you, you're gonna die in one hit or very close to it. So that is one that is almost a force ban in most scenarios. Savior Auden can dodge Frenzied Strike and actually counter with Gust Slash, and depending on how Auden is built, there's a pretty good chance that that might outright kill you. Last Rider Crow is also not particularly a great matchup for you because, you know, Mobile Weapon Siegfried does a lot of damage and you are all AoE attacks. And depending on how RNG goes, you might be eating a lot of bikes. Your whole team might be dead. And even though, you know, Abyssal's a really good hyper carry, she can't exactly 1v4 in the same way that like Apocalypse Robbie could a year ago. So yeah, that's not particularly great. Bright Witch's Saria is another bad matchup for the most part because you have the defense break, which will not only reduce your damage, but allow her entire team to run you over. And because of her S2 passive, you can't revive on Holy Sacrifice, so that's not particularly good. And then the last two characters I want to highlight here are Naqual, and by extension Lua, as well as Archdemon Shadow. If you recall from the skills section when we talked about Frenzied Strike, interestingly enough, it has a 4 to 5 turn cooldown depending on Molagora. You need to have Frenzied Strike off of cooldown while also having 100 Fighting Spirit to activate the skill. If a character like Lua or Naqual pushes back your skill cooldowns, even if you have 100% Fighting Spirit, you cannot activate Frenzied Strike. Therefore, you cannot get trauma and you cannot go into beast mode essentially and clean up the enemy team. So intelligent players that hold their skills or time them appropriately can absolutely shut you down. Naqual and Archdemon Shadow also are very good against you because of the seal mechanic. By turning off Inner Abyss, they can combat readiness push with impunity. They can obviously focus you down because you will not gain Fighting Spirit from being hit anymore because that is a component of the passive. You also lose access to your actual counter and you will not have the ability to cleanse debuffs even if you have full Fighting Spirit, which is very, very bad because obviously Naqual and Archdemon Shadow both have a lot of debuffs in the kit, and that's not super great for you. So do keep that in mind. And that's going to do it for yet another how to play guide. If I made any mistakes on this one, you can let me know down in the comment section below. And if you want to see more guides in the same style, there should be a playlist on your screen now. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. It does help me out here a ton and does allow me to continue bringing you more high quality guides like this one. As always, enjoy the rest of your day, the rest of your week, and I will see you all in the next one. Have a happy holiday now.